Kate here with another video. Hope everyone is doing well. And again, if you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. Helps me build the channel. A few updates here. My Facebook account might have been blocked, but I don't really know. The other day I got a message. I was checking Facebook and I got a message that my account has been blocked for my protection, of course, because they detected suspicious activity. Said I had to go through a couple of these screens, and finally it said they needed, I think it was one U.S. Picture, U.S. government approved of picture ID, a photo ID, to like prove I was who I was. And I'm not going to do that. In other words, that would mean, my Facebook name is Caitlin Yulianoff. I couldn't use that. They're cracking down on pseudonyms. It's all for your own protection, of course. And I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to go out of my way to prove I am who I say I am. As far as Facebook is concerned, I'm Caitlin Yulianoff from Vladivostok, Russia. That's all Mark Zuckerberg, me and his advertising clients and his clients in the security state need to know. So if that's it, I'm off Facebook, forget it. Apparently, I checked it, though, like a day later, I used another browser and a different URL popped up, and I got on it fine. I actually posted a few things. So I'm unclear. My hunch that the software they use for blocking people is maybe browser dependent. I can get around it by using a different browser. They'll probably catch up with me eventually. If I'm off, if they do block it for good, I'm not gonna send any of my documents to Mark Zuckerberg. He doesn't need to know any of that stuff. I may start a small Facebook account, another account, like probably have to do it from a town library or something. Have maybe like 20 or 30, no more than 30 people who I want to stay in touch with. Okay, anyway, this video is on the movie Avatar, 2009 James Cameron film Avatar. Really interesting movie. I have very mixed emotions about it. Partly, I found some elements of it to be very compelling, but also it's a crap movie. It's a completely crap movie. Interestingly, it was one of the highest gross, made more money, highest gross movies. It was one of the highest grossing movies in history. Like, I believe they spent $239 million in making it, but it grossed close to $3 billion. Like, whoa. But at the same time, it left barely a mark on public consciousness. It was really eerie. Made an incredible amount of money out of it, but it kind of left barely a mark. People don't talk about it. You don't see a lot of memes. There's some, there's a Reddit forum, there's a couple of forums, internet forums on it, but the movie almost vanished without trace. They made a sequel of it, which came out very recently. I haven't seen it. I may watch it. Anyway, some thoughts about this movie. This isn't a hardcore review. It's more some thoughts. James Cameron, of course, he directed Titanic. He's mostly a science fiction director, directed one of the Aliens movies, Terminator, a bunch of other films. He got his start as a tech guy, science fiction tech guy. He's a Canadian. Apparently, he was planning Avatar back when he made Titanic around that time. But he said the technology, the CGI, didn't exist yet at that time. He was planning on it for the future. He was drawing up plans for it back then. Well, it came out in 2009. I saw it. Really interesting, amazing CGI, like really exquisite world building. And I did find this part to be very compelling. As a movie, it's garbage in some ways. In a way, I really mixed feelings about it. It's a powerful anti-imperialist film, but also subverts its own message. And I'll talk about some of the stuff. Okay, so basically for movie Avatar, first, a very important thing in really any Hollywood epics, but in recent decades, is the idea of the monomyth. Theory came, I believe Joseph Campbell came up with this theory. He died about 10 years ago. Joseph Campbell was a scholar of comparative mythology. He studied myths and religions, mostly myths around the world. He wrote a series of books called The Masks of God from the 1950s to the 1970s. I went through a Joseph Campbell stage. I read a lot of his stuff. I have some of his books back here. Interesting guy. He started off I think if you read some of his books who were in the 50s, he was kind of a McCarthyite, but he kind of mellowed later on. Towards the end of his life, actually, apparently, he talked about some of his books. He went to Grateful Dead concerts. He probably dosed, he probably did acid. He didn't say this, but it's kind of implied. Interesting cat. He became something of a pop culture figure in the 90s. There was Bill Moyers interviews with him on PBS. And then later on, there's some PBS documentary series on interesting guy, a huge influence on Hollywood. Now, Joseph Campbell talked about mythology, came up there, or I think he invented the term mythopoetic. Basically, myths, of course, are explanations for pre-scientific people, like why it rains, why the seasons change, why night and day follow each other. It explains the world for people without before the age of science. It also justifies a social structure, like why feudal lords rules, why the priest kings rules, stuff like that. And Campbell talked about this in his books, but he also thought that myths provide perform another function. And it was kind of a sort of a psychological, almost spiritual function. He was influenced by Carl Jung, a famous Swiss psychologist. Very, very briefly here, Carl Jung was a follower of Freud, part of his Vienna circle. One time he was a leader of the Freud's psychoanalytic group, but he had a break with Freud. Carl Jung studied mythology and comparative religions, and basically he had the idea of archetypes, that there are archetypes in myth, like motifs which are repeated over and over in myths and legends around the world. The idea of archetypes, he had the idea of a collective unconscious that we tap into, thoughts and memories of the human race, which we can tap into. He had the idea of anima and an animus. Woman has an animus, a male side, man has an anima. He had the idea of a shadow, like shadow is that part of yourself which you don't want to accept. Interestingly, Jimmy Dore, apparently the leftist YouTuber, got into Jungian psychology recently. Okay. So Joseph Campbell was not a strict Jungian. He actually said that strict Jungians don't like him. Some don't really like him. He's not a strict Jungian, but he uses Jungian concepts. Okay, interesting guy. And Joseph Campbell had the idea of like a monomyth that basically said there's one myth with 10,000 variations. You talk about the hero's journey, a quest, and this is super common, like fantasy literature, even in legends, the Grail legends about King Arthur, the Knights at the Round Table, the Grail cycle, Tolkien, any fantasy literature whatsoever. The idea of a quest, a heroic quest, the hero's journey, and there's certain stages people go through, the hero goes through, the protagonist may go through. I'm not going to get into this. The purpose of this video is not to explore all this, but just to mention it. Interestingly, there was kind of a couple of years ago, there was some interest in Joseph Campbell from the left. There was this socialist, like post-Maoist group called the Kasama Project, started by Mike Ely or Eric Brandt. He's a Chicago activist. They split from the RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, when it became like a cult group around Bob Avakian. So this Kasama Project is split this group, like a sort of a regrouping organization. They didn't last very long. The Kasama Project, it didn't last very long, basically imploded. At one point, Mike Ely, the founder, tried to tighten it up. And as I understand, the leadership just left. They just resigned and dropped out en masse without telling anyone. So the rank and file of this organization all of a sudden woke up and then the organization was gone. Anyway, interestingly, I was Facebook friends with some members of the Kasama Project. They mostly blocked or unfriended me because I had some controversial opinions. I don't have a high opinion of their politics, but one of the members of the Kasama Project, members, not leadership, but a member, Doug Green, and he's a big Star Wars fan. He was a Facebook friend. He's a big Star Wars fan. And Star Wars, George Lucas has often said this, was very much influenced by Joseph Campbell. Everything, Star Wars is chock full of Joseph Campbell monomyth tropes. And apparently Doug found out about this, and there was kind of a discussion. The Kasama Project had this forum, which, I don't have a high opinion of their politics, but there's a forum which had some really interesting discussions for a time, and they mentioned Joseph Campbell. They didn't come to any conclusions exactly, but they discussed what possibility use Joseph Campbell could have to the left. Some interesting discussions. There's interestingly a Marxist analog of Carl Jung or Joseph Campbell, a guy named German philosopher named Ernst Bloch. He was an East German philosopher, I believe, in the 60s and 70s. He was an academic at the University of Berlin. He was actually kicked out of East Germany. He was expelled. But anyway, he was a Marxist. He was a heretic. He wrote two books, The Principle of Hope. There were a bunch of books, but The Principle of Hope, which is volume 1, volume 2. I read volume 1. Volume 2 is supposed to be the real meat of it. Anyway, Ernst Bloch said about Carl Jung, there's probably something to the Jungian archetypes, but Carl Jung himself was a reactionary. He was basically a conservative romantic. During the 1930s, Carl Jung apparently seemed to be somewhat sympathetic to Hitler. He quickly backed away, like one of these people backed away when Hitler started losing the war, but he was somewhat sympathetic to the Nazis. Ernst Bloch said, Carl Jung was a reactionary, but there's probably something to the Jungian archetypes. But Jung, as a reactionary, looked back to the past, like the Middle Ages, like fantasy literature set in the Middle Ages or pseudo-Middle Ages, or Jung wanted to go back to what Ernst Bloch called the primeval ooze and one-cell organisms. Ernst Bloch wanted to use these archetypes in a progressive sense, a forward-looking sense. He wrote the book, The Principle of Hope, was kind of about utopian principle, utopia as an archetype, not literal utopia, but as an archetype, and he discussed how it appears in different cultures and different religions. He thought there was a progressive drive, not that literally real, but the myths can have a progressive drive. As far as I remember, the Kasama Project people didn't know about Ernst Bloch. They didn't mention it. But anyway, okay, so the reason why I'm mentioning this, because it's had this monomyth, the idea that there's one myth with 10,000 variations, had a huge impact on Hollywood. Maybe not a good impact. There was a story that in the 90s, a Hollywood producer, forget his name, but brought a bunch of people to his office and had a Rolodex. They'd roll a Rolodex back then, like a big file of stuff, which had elements of myths. And what he had people do is like cut and paste. They couldn't choose. You could design your own myth take from A, B, C, and design a myth. His producer showed his friends what use this could be for Hollywood. And this is like a completely vulgarized version of Joseph Campbell's work, of his theory. He had potentially a very profound theory, but Hollywood, as usual, takes a very one-dimensional, vulgar interpretation of it. I don't know what Joseph Campbell himself thought of this. He was aware of Star Wars. He knew about Star Wars. I don't know if he said much about it. Okay, anyway. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is Introduction to Avatar is chock full of monomyth stuff. And I'm not going to go into this really deeply. Purpose of this video is not to discuss like monomyth tropes in Avatar. It's like a stereotypical college term paper. You can Google it online, look it up, like the hero's quest in James Cameron's Avatar. It's like a stereotypical college term paper. Like I take English 101, somebody writes this, and there are tons of stuff like this online. You can look it up. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the movie, maybe a bit of a plot spoiler. Well, there's not much of a plot here. Okay, so the movie, it's science fiction, takes place, remember, in the 23rd century when Earth is running out of natural resources. There's a brief glimpse of Earth at that time, very crowded, overpopulated, running out of natural resources. And the Earth is very dependent on something called unobtainium, a substance called unobtainium. It's not defined exactly what unobtainium is or what people do with it, but it's really needed to keep things going, and it's very rare on Earth. You can, however, it's been located on a planet called Pandora, which the name itself has mythological implications. It's on this planet called Pandora. So the movie starts in this research station, Earth research station, research colony on Pandora. Pandora is uninhabitable by humans, very noxious gases, very poisonous, dangerous for humans. However, there is life on Pandora. It's teeming with life. So this Earth research is sort of partly research run by this really exploitative company, and they're there to get this unobtainium. Okay, so the thing is, there's aliens, they're intelligent beings already on Pandora, that people called the Navi. And the Navi are very tall, blue, are shown as blue. Interesting, there's a bit of a pun there. The term avatar comes from what was used a lot around 2010 or so. It's used in video games and used in internet around 2010. I haven't heard in a while. But the avatar means like an identity, you assume. It comes from Hinduism. And because an avatar is like incarnation of a god. So the Navi themselves are blue. That's kind of a takeoff on that. If I remember Krishna, the character Krishna in Hindu mythology, I think it was Krishna, was blue. The blue boy was an avatar of Vishnu, if I remember it correctly. So it's kind of a spoof on that. It was a subtle pun. Okay. So anyway, there's this Earth colony research station. It's very hot. Pandora is very hostile to humans, but it's like a protected environment. So there's this character. So what they do is company has this guy, hires this young guy named Jake Sully as their agent. He's a Marine or former Marine. I don't know if US Marine or some future space Marine. But his twin brother died. His twin brother who was in the Marines who died. So Jake Sully is genetically equivalent to him. So they offered him this position on doing this work for this company on the planet to look for unobtainium. Jake Sully himself is quadriplegic. He can't move. He's totally paralyzed. He has to use this big machine to get around. And the deal is the company makes him this offer to, if he can locate unobtainium, hopefully get it from whoever these Navi intelligent aliens are. If he can get this unobtainium, they'll give him his powers back. They'll somehow do genetic engineering, whatever, and restore his abilities. There's a bit of a Marxist trope in this, like, the Marxist theory of religion, that underclass society, people's human powers are denied. That's why in religion or fantasy literature, even like human powers are denied. So people project it in these fantasy worlds, religious fantasy world, can pretend to be like, think about an omnipotent God that's human powers projected into an imaginary deity. Basic Marxist thought. And Marx talked about this like in an introduction to a critique of Hegel's philosophy of law. It's really interesting. Christianity is the heart of a heartless world. And if you're kind of very poetic. So I saw a bit of a Marxist trope in here. But anyway, according to the monomyth theory, first Jake Sully, in fact, his twin brother died, was like, and they offered him this job, was like a call to the adventure. That's the first part of the joke, a call to a heroic journey. And often the protagonist would maybe turn it down several times before finally accepting this. So Jake Sully accepts this, and they train him. He's undergoing training, and somehow they put him into the body of a Navi. I don't know how they, futuristic technology, they grow a Navi body and they use it to project his own consciousness temporarily into this Navi, and he's released onto the surface of the planet. His job is to locate the unobtainium and see what he can do to get it, versus there's an intelligence reconnaissance to check out what the situation was. Okay. So first he's kind of awkward. He's used to being like paraplegic, not moving. Now he's in this huge alien body. The Navi is really huge and blue. And he has to cope with this totally alien body. So he spends the night in this jungle. Now the planet Pandora is very hostile to human life, but it's teeming with its own life. It's actually teeming. And very interesting thing, the planet itself is shown as translucent, like it's almost psychedelic. Like they gave, when I saw the movie came out in 2010, I saw it in 2010, they gave people these 3D glasses. It was a fad in the 50s, but with this technology ramped up. So it's kind of like virtual reality, fully immersive 3D virtual reality. I tried it, didn't really work with me. I mentioned this in an earlier video, that my eyes don't really focus together, and I pretty much see out of one eye. But friends of mine who saw it say it was like being in a dream. You're in this like the surface of the planet Pandora. It's like a dream. It's very vivid. It's almost psychedelic. Amazing CGI. I got to give them credit for that. They spent a huge amount of money on it and highly sophisticated, amazing CGI. And it's really literally hallucinogenic. And I'll get back to that in a minute. Okay, so Jake Sully spends first night or first couple of days on this planet, and he almost gets killed. He's not prepared at all for the life. He almost there's dog-like creatures chase after him, and then this weird I don't know, dragon-like pterodactyl creatures after him, all kinds of stuff. And this is again fits the monomyth trope that the hero goes through a period of trials. Well, I think on the second night there, he meets a young woman, and I actually forget her name. It doesn't even matter. He meets this young woman who, he was surprised, like he's such a klutz, like he's a total klutz, like she picks up you're not from here, are you? He said, no. And she shows him the ropes, and somewhat improbably, they fall in love. So this young woman, and I think her name is Aya, I forget her name actually, but she takes Jake in his form of Navi, in his avatar, takes him to a village of people. Now, the Navi people live in trees. Their whole culture is based in the forest. They're based on trees. They're tree dwelling. They're shown as they don't really have technology, but they're highly plugged into the technology of this planet. They're completely plugged into it. Like they live in there are a couple of types of trees. There's a home tree, which is where they live. There's another type of tree, which the Navi they have the braids, long hair and braids. They put their braid into this tree, and it's like plugging into the internet. They have all the knowledge. They connect with all living things on the planet. This tree has the collective memory of these people, like where you die, that's where you go to. And the Navi people seems very ecological. Everything is like a unity with nature. It's very appealing. It's shown as very appealing. This woman who shows Jake around, her mother is actually the chief priestess or the spiritual advisor of these people. So very lucky for Jake. I remember Jake also has to fend off. There's a love interest. Young male Navi is also interested in this young woman, and Jake kind of pushes. He's seen as a bit of a jerk, but he's easily dispensed with. Okay, that's a start. Then Jake, then he goes back. I don't know how he does this. He goes back to his space station, back to the colony, and he reports on what he's found. So it turns out there is unobtainium. Where a lot of it is located is right underneath the home tree of these people, of the Navi's main home tree, this particular settlement, Navi settlement. So they're going to have to go in, the company's going to have to go in and destroy their home tree to get this unobtainium. Okay, so they brief him, and there shows him. There's scientists. There's a woman anthropologist. I forget her name, but there are a couple other people who are, there's a male, there's Jake Sully, his boss is this really tough Marine guy, like a drill sergeant character. And there's some one-liners. The dialogue is like cartoonish, totally cartoonish, which really wrecks the movie. Dialogue is so cartoonish, but here's this drill sergeant character who is kind of a tough Marine Corps guy. On one side, he's the male leader. The female leader is an anthropologist. She's much nicer. She's a bit gruff as well and doesn't seem to really like Jake, but she's more kinder, a little more humanistic, and the group of scientists who shows a little more humanistic. And there's some tension going on in this space colony, human space colony on this planet, when the scientists are more humanistic, and then the military people. This company is shown as basically exploitive and looking for rational resources. Okay, so then Jake is sent back a second time, like to reconnoiter, see what he can do to manipulate these Navi people to try to get get the unobtainium under the tree. And at one point, he finally admits to them what he's doing. He's a spy. He admits to him. He admits this to him, what he's doing. And they're shocked, and they turn against him. But just in the nick of time, he's able to sort of rival these pterodactyl type lizard creatures, and he shocks them. Like, this is amazing. I don't know how this happened. He jumps on this pterodactyl, and he's able to control it. And they flies around the area, and they're shocked. Like, it reminds the Navi people of one of the past mythological culture heroes who did the same thing. So this follows the monomyth trope. I'm not going to get into this too much, but it follows the whole monomyth thing. So, okay, Jake Sully rises. So he totally impresses the Navi, and they finally accept him. In fact, there's one scene where he tells them, he's a human, he's in this Navi body. They work out this thing where he's moved into the Navi body permanently. And this is like a rebirth, a mythological rebirth. He finally becomes a Navi. He's finally brought his quest, hero's journeys to come to face his true destiny, which is as a leader of the Navi liberation struggle, in effect. So the scene kind of ends. He has a fight. He turns against. He realizes the people in the space station. His boss realizes Jake has turned against them. He doesn't want the simulation of his human powers, like get his ability to walk back. He gets the whole thing. He becomes a Navi. I don't know what happens to his human body actually, but he becomes a Navi. Okay, so there's one scene where he's fighting his drill sergeant boss. He's a Navi, but the drill sergeant boss is in this like mechanical type, his mechanical body. It's really interesting contrast, mechanical like tank backhoe type thing. And it's really interesting contrast. Well, as Jake leads this Navi rebellion against the company, there's one scene really sad and enraging where it shows the home tree where his Navi people live being destroyed and a lot of Navi fleeing from the area. Like, I thought, of course, remind me of like the Trail of Tears when the Cherokee Nation who was kicked out of like Georgia and Tennessee, the region by Andrew Jackson. Or there's zillion. Noam Chomsky talked about what he called the 500-year Reich, whole history of Western civilization, Western capitalism, imperialism, whatever through different stages, destroying indigenous people, wrecking indigenous cultures, and on. You could go on and on, oceans and oceans of blood. And this is still very much going on today. So it's reflected in this movie Avatar. There's one scene where people are fleeing. And it's kind of sort of resolved the end. Finally, the Navi do fight back, and at least temporarily push the humans. That pushes a greedy capitalist company out. Okay, so that's the basic movie. Some things about it. The CGI is absolutely exquisite, really amazing. I found the whole thing about the Navi to be very, very compelling. The dialogue of the movie as a whole is like cartoon quality. It's barely watchable. It really falls apart. The movie, it's Hollywood crap, Hollywood glop in a way. I'm kind of a Criterion Collection type of girl. But anyway, so some thoughts about it. First, where did James Cameron get his ideas from? The movie is highly derivative, extremely derivative. First, there's a British architect named Roger Dean. He was famous for doing the Yes album covers and a bunch of other rock album covers in the 70s, as a Topographic Ocean, a few other albums, really trippy Yes album covers. He was famous for doing that. There are definite tropes. I still have it on somebody's portfolio of Roger Dean's work. I was kind of a fan of his like psychedelic artwork. Roger Dean had the thing that the trope about the floating islands, and the islands, like some island type islands with triangular soil dangling underneath, and they're floating in the air. That's in Roger Dean's artwork, and it's also in Avatar. I've seen the video game as well, but I'm pretty sure it was originated by Roger Dean. I don't know what it means. I don't know what the symbolism means, but you see it in Avatar. The pteranodon type creatures, it's from Roger Dean. Even the basic atmosphere, the art, the visuals, very much from Roger Dean. And I remember reading, like I was intrigued by this movie. I researched it like around 2011, 2012. I did a little research on it. I remember Roger Dean was saying, like, his friends saying something like, you got to sue this James Cameron. He's blatantly ripping you off. You got to sue him. And initially he didn't want to, but I think in 2014 he did press a lawsuit. I mean, it's pretty obviously derived from his work, pretty blatantly. Roger Dean did press a lawsuit. As I understand, it was thrown out, recently thrown out. I don't know, the creative process is complicated. Artists always unconsciously borrowing from one another. And as a socialist, I'm not sure how I feel about the intellectual property rights anyway, but I think artists should get some compensation for their work or be recognized for their work. It was a blatant ripoff of Roger Dean, Push the movie. The plot, or not really the plot, but the basic scenario, came from a novel by Ursula Le Guin, a fantasy science fiction writer. It's called The Word for World is Forest. It's really intriguing. Now, I'm a big Ursula Le Guin fan. I read a fair amount of her stuff over the years. She died a few years ago. She was an anarchist, anti-capitalist anarchist. Apparently, she was into Mary Bookchin, the philosophy of Mary Bookchin. I think one of the last things she wrote was an introduction to the collected works of Mary Bookchin. Anyway, some of her stuff, although I'm a Marxist, I don't totally agree with Ursula Le Guin's politics or ideas, but her work I found was very compelling. One of her best books, I think, was a book called The Dispossessed. It's kind of a coming of age story. I think anyone on the left should read The Dispossessed. Okay, I'll talk about that just for a second. The Dispossessed is spoofing on Dostoevsky, a novel by the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky called The Possessed. And if you read Dostoevsky, guy is freaking trippy as hell. If you don't take him that seriously, he's trippy as hell. Basically, has these really down and out characters who are agonizing about the meaning of life, constantly on the brink of suicide, over the meaning of life, brooding. So anyway, The Possessed is, he wrote in the 1880s. It's about a communist revolution in a small town, Siberia, and there are these totally overwrought characters. It's a trippy. Most of the anti-communist tropes of the right, like Turning Point USA or some of this right-wing stuff, the anti-communist tropes largely came from Dostoevsky, from this book, The Possessed. And this was like 50 years before the Russian Revolution. It's really interesting. The book is, politically it's crap, but it's a pretty wild read. Anyway, so Ursula Le Guin wrote The Dispossessed, is kind of partly spoofing on Dostoevsky. The Dispossessed is about an anarcho-communist colony on this planet. The scenario is there's a planet which is very much like Earth. It has a moon, which is closer. The moon is much closer, easier to get to, and it's habitable. It's largely desert, but it's habitable. And 100 years before the action takes place in her book, there's a workers' revolution on this planet, or a board of workers' revolution, and the deal worked out. These workers won't be allowed to take power, but they'll be allowed to immigrate and form a colony on the moon, on this planet's moon, and they do. They form like an anarchist communist colony, and it goes over. The colony itself sounds very appealing. She describes it. They cut themselves off from Earth, or from the whole planet. They develop their own language. They don't want any contact at all. They don't want to contaminate themselves. Okay, so the book involves a coming of age of a young physicist on this world, on this anarchist world. Character's named Shevek, and he kind of, although this colony is utopian and liberatory and sounds really appealing, there's some inner creeping authoritarianism in it. And the Shevek gradually comes to find this out. In fact, finds at one point there's actually a concentration camp on this utopian colony. And, he comes back to the home world, which is involved in the Cold War. There's an exaggerated version of the US and an exaggerated version of the Soviet Union, which is like known as communist, but kind of authoritarian, centralized communist. And anyway, it's really moving. It's a coming of age story. Like her idea was like there's an ambiguous utopia. There's no such thing as absolute utopia. It's always a process. And some other books, it's okay. My dog, Max here, he gets tracheal problems. Like he'll start have trouble breathing sometimes. So anyway, Okay, so some other books by Ursula Le Guin I really like was Malafrina. It's historical fiction. It's a fictionalized version of the revolution of 1848 in Hungary. And it's a coming of age story of a young radical aristocrat. It's really moving. I can't really convey it, but I think anyone on the left should read this in their teens or early 20s. I actually read it in my late 20s or early 30s. I don't remember. Really moving book. And okay, some other stuff. Four Ways to Forgiveness by Ursula Le Guin is really interesting. It's a series of short stories in this book. They're all about this planet, which starts off as a slave planet. There's a very brutal ruling class, which has extremely brutal slavery. There's an uprising, a revolution against this, which is successful, but the revolution itself is very, very bloody. And the revolutionaries finally take power, but they're kind of patriarchal in some ways, and they're a new set of problems. Some of this book is partly a takeoff on the Chinese Cultural Revolution and partly a takeoff on African liberation struggles. It's really, I can't really convey, but really interesting book. Okay, for the movie, and there are a couple other books. Always Coming Home by Ursula Le Guin, which is a fictional culture supposedly lives in California, 40,000 years in the future, something like that. They're kind of sort of. Ursula Le Guin had an anthropology background. She was the daughter of Alfred Kroeber, famous American anthropologist. There's a lot of anthropology in her work. She's not a hard science fiction writer, not hard science, but more like a humanism. Okay. So Always Coming Home is about the coming of age of a young woman in this futuristic society in California, like 40,000 years in the future. It's really interesting. She developed a whole culture. Anyway, so as far as Avatar goes, the important book is a short novel of novella Ursula Le Guin wrote in the early 70s called The Word for World is Forest. And I read the book like years ago, and I don't remember much of the plot. Basically, again, science fiction takes place, I think, in this 22nd century. Earth has gone through turmoil and ecological catastrophes, but now it's united under some kind of central world government, and very authoritarian, and they're very imperialistic, and they're desperate for natural resources. And they find it on what they need on this planet. They send this guy, kind of a space marine, to kind of a very similar scenario to this planet. And on this planet, the aliens, I forget their name, live kind of in harmony with nature. They're tree dwelling people. They're tree dwelling. They live very much in harmony with nature, but these humans come and exploit them. There's some horrific scenes of they're made into sex slaves, actually. Some very vivid, she describes very vividly, some real violence against these. The plot isn't the same as Avatar, but the overall scenario is. Now, Ursula Le Guin herself, in the introduction, partly disavowed the book. She said, she thinks it was preachy and pretentious. And she said she wrote it during the Vietnam era, and she was very angry about U.S. imperialism, what the U.S. was doing. But she felt she was a little overly pretentious in this book. Really interesting. Okay, now the interesting thing is, she said, I think in the afterwards, she was influenced, or she thinks she was unconsciously influenced by reading about a group of people in Malaysia called the Synoid. Now, the Synoid are real people, a tribe in northern Malaysia. I believe they work in the timber industry. There was an anthropologist / journalist who encountered them in the late 1930s. And I forget this guy's name, but he wrote stuff. The Synoid were dreaming is a big part of their culture. In fact, they're big in lucid dreaming. These people can control their dreams. And the Synoid use it for sex, for enhanced sexual pleasure. And they also use it for their own psychological well-being, for dealing with problems in society, for their own psychotherapy. Their culture is very much based on dreams. And it's made a big stir. Think about the Synoid. They're part of the aspect of the culture. The dreaming played a big role, made a big stir. In fact, there was a therapy or movement called Synoid dream therapy. It was in the US. It was kind of like a California pop psychology, like California had zillions of movements like this, but the Synoid, something called Synoid dream theory, you can look up on Wikipedia. I think it's still around, actually. Very interesting. Anyway, a woman, and I forget her name, like she was a psychotherapist of sorts, a practitioner of Synoid dream therapy, or dream theory. What she wanted to do, she went to Malaysia to look up the Synoid, and you'll get it from firsthand. There's people who went to Synoid dream therapy, got it from secondhand accounts. She wanted to get from firsthand account from the Synoid themselves. So she went to Malaysia and looked up these people and did her own research. And she found out the whole thing was bullshit. This dreaming does not play any role in Synoid culture. Whole thing was largely faked, entirely fake. This anthropologist who wrote about them and popularized this was fabulous. He's made stuff up, but it fit in what people thought they wanted. People thought they were lacking in their own culture. So anyway, Ursula Le Guin mentioned this. She didn't mention the fact that it was fake, that was debunked, but she said, I probably unconsciously base this on the Synoid, people who use dreaming a lot in their culture. She mentioned this. So it's really interesting. The Synoid may have influenced Ursula Le Guin in this book, who in turn influenced the Navi, James Cameron's Navi and Avatar. Some interesting connections there. And it's interesting, the whole thing about dreaming was largely faked. People were projecting onto like indigenous people what they wanted to see in themselves. Okay, finally, I'll have to mention the title of this video, Dancing with Smurfs, not original on my parts, came up with, built by, I heard it from Caleb Maupin. I kind of like Caleb Maupin, the Facebook left, these people, Marxist discussion group. I hate him. They think he's a secret Nazi. I don't get it. No, I don't think he is. No, he's a pretty interesting Marxist. I don't fully agree with him. I would love to have a debate with him. I don't hate Caleb Maupin. Anyway, he says some stuff I really agree with. He's pushing back against like the synthetic left, the shit lib left. I don't fully agree with him about some things, but he briefly mentioned Avatar. You call it like Dancing with Smurfs. So he's referring to the white savior complex aspect of the movie. It seemed like Dances with Wolves with Kevin Costner. He's like an army scout, like during or right after the Civil War. He makes contact with his Native American tribe. First, they really hate him, then becomes adopted to their tribe, and later becomes an advocate for them. It's using like a white person as their savior. It's kind of denying agency for indigenous people in their own liberation. And then, could say on the other hand, it's a narrative device. I mean, Avatar people would more identify with the whole thing more if, someone the audience could identify with brings them into the action. So I don't really know myself. Caleb Maupin, interestingly, he's kind of he's not a Nazi, but he's kind of a time warp. Like he's type of 1930s type socialism. Like he's very much of a productivist. Like Trotsky, and Caleb Maupin does not like Trotsky, but Trotsky had some statement in the late 30s about, what communists would say to capitalists, we'll beat you in steel production and iron production. We'll beat you in building cities and industrial output. And I forget the exact quote, but Caleb Maupin would probably very much agree with this quote. I was surprised. It's like the way people thought 1930 socialism, like productivism, building, expanding industry. I grew up more in the era of the environmental movement. People should live in harmony with nature. Like before I got into Marxism, I was kind of a hippie. And so I kind of more identify with this. I tell people I'm a William Morris socialist. William Morris was a British, he was a Marxist, British artist. He was one of the founders of the arts and crafts movement. And his version of socialism was like, I think it was News from Nowhere, was like a really laid back, rural, pastoral, sort of ecotopian type of socialism. The dominant paradigm has been kind of an industrial type paradigm, So I don't really know. And there are people who would say, it's living in harmony with nature is reactionary. There's a book by an Indian writer, I think Gayatri Spivak, I read a couple of years ago. I forget the name of the book. She wrote it during when the BJP party first gained power in India in the 90s. And she talked about the increasing importance of religiosity in India, and mythology in India. It's still very, very important today in India. She thought that was scary and dangerous. If you want to live in harmony with nature, it means your social order. Nature justifies the repressive social, like the Indian caste system. So she thought this a type of disenchantment was necessary for social progress. I don't know. I really don't know. I've gone back and forth a lot. Um, uh, yeah, as I mentioned, the world was seen as movie Avatar. Pandora was translucent, was psychedelic. This harkens back to Aldous Huxley, the British novelist. He wrote famous for writing Brave New World. His brother was Julian Huxley, who possibly was head of UNESCO and possibly played a somewhat sinister role. He was a proponent of eugenics after the Second World War. Julian Huxley may have played a sinister role, but Aldous Huxley, I am a fan. I went to a big Aldous Huxley stage. He wrote Brave New World, of course, but he also wrote Island, which is idea of a utopia, a variety of other things. He wrote this book called The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell. The Doors of Perception was about a mescaline trip he took, and the band The Doors got their name from it. Heaven and Hell was kind of his theory of aesthetics. Basically talking about some artwork has what he called a transportive aspect. He said there's a visionary realm, like right in the unconscious mind, which we have, which some artwork can like temporarily send you back, like psychedelic or psychotropic art can reflect, like talk about ceramics, like sort of psychedelic ceramics. He wrote this in the era before color TV, but he would have understood this. Like, anyway, it's very much connected to this movie, very much connected to Avatar's site. It's definitely a visionary other world. So you go to it, apparently Therapist, I read The Therapist around the time the movie came out. Therapist reported the syndrome where people went to a depression because they couldn't live in that world. It's just very interesting. I mean, take shrooms, I guess, is a good way of getting there. So anyway, just some thoughts. So Caleb Maupin himself would be kind of more, he's a cultural conservative, he's a socialist, he's a Marxist, but he's cultural conservative. He calls himself like a suit and tie socialist, looks buttoned down. Like he's very much of a cultural conservative. And that's okay, that's totally okay. I'm more of a hippie myself, so I don't really know, some interesting ideas. Finally, Ursula Le Guin herself kind of obliquely referred to Avatar. Apparently she didn't really, when it came out, people asked her, like, were you part of this film? This looks like your novel. The word for world as far as it's like just out of your novel. Were you connected with this? She said, no. In fact, James Cameron never acknowledged Ursula Le Guin's influence, never. But she obviously was, but never acknowledged it. But people asked Le Guin, were you connected? She said, no. She said, the basic premise was completely different, and they're very similar, but Ursula was kind of a pacifist. Like the culmination of her novel, The Word for World is Farce, these indigenous people finally have an uprising, very violent uprising against the Earth imperialists. And violence was not originally part of their culture. It was alien to their culture. And the theme of the book was, exploring what this means for these people. They had to be violent to preserve themselves, but what does it do to them? James Cameron's movie took a somewhat different take. The violence, accepting violence as legitimate, was a central premise of the idea. Like this guy, Jake Sully, led them in a violent struggle, a warfare against the human imperialists. So kind of Ursula Le Guin herself said, yeah, I have had nothing to do with this she didn't mention the movie, but a high grossing Hollywood blockbuster, and I'm glad I've had nothing to do with it. So she kind of obliquely slammed the movie. And it's kind of interesting, and I'll kind of close it there. I am planning more videos. I'm hoping to do this twice a week. See how it goes. Next video on tensions with China really ramping up. Strike wave, which is really exciting, an unofficial general strike in some ways. And I want to talk about this, and also ramping up the security state, which is pretty scary and even terrifying. Anyway, till then, see you later, and hope you enjoy my video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy my work. Thank you.